In the criminal justice system,
Speeding.
offenses are considered especially heinous. In New York City, the dedicated detectives who investigate these vicious felonies are members of an elite squad known as the Special Victims Unit. These are their stories.
In the courtroom, everyone awaits the final trial of Morrison versus the people. The prosecution accuses Ms. Morrison of speeding during her return trip from visiting the mountains. Here are our defendants.
I'm Richard.
I'm Sarah.
I'm Jasmine.
Exhibit A!
The trial has begun and the prosecution has brought forth Exhibit A. Exhibit A shows a map of the different towns Ms. Morrison drove through. To find the slowest speed that Ms. Morrison could have gone through for her whole trip, we must divide the total distance by the amount of time it took for Ms. Morrison to go from Acceleratron to G prime. When we add the miles between the towns from Acceleratron to G prime, we get an answer of 100 miles. Then, we found the total time that our defendant took for her trip, which was 2.3 hours. To find the minimum speed or velocity of her trip, we did 100 miles divided by 2.3 hours, and when doing this, we found out that Ms. Morrison could have been driving at least 43 miles per hour to get to her destination. 43 miles per hour is much less than the speed limit, which is 65 miles per hour. Therefore, this piece of evidence does not prove that our defendant, Ms. Morrison, was speeding. So Exhibit A only talked about...
Exhibit B!
As the trial continued, new evidence was brought in to prove Miss Morrison's guilt, and we have been shown Exhibit B. Now, Exhibit B had shown a map that showed Miss Morrison's journey from Acceleratron to DXDT, and this graph was modeled by the function s of t equals negative 91t cubed plus 167t squared minus 30t. By utilizing our graphing calculator, we managed to find the derivative of this function in order to see the certain velocities that Miss Morrison was driving throughout her entire trip. And as we have found, there were certain moments that it appeared that Miss Morrison was actually speeding when she claimed she was not.
Exhibit C! Neener, neener, neener.
In addition to Exhibit B's graph of showing that Miss Morrison was guilty, a new piece of evidence, Exhibit C, was brought in. Now, this graph showed the distance from DXDT to G prime. And as we did with the last graph, using our graphing calculator, we changed this piecewise function to find its derivative. And as we did that, we discovered that on the graph of the derivative, there were also points of time in which it seemed that Miss Morrison had sped.
Exhibit B and C.
Although Exhibits B and C seem to prove Miss Morrison's guilt, it is clear that we have found a flaw in her evidence, their evidence, to prove that she was guilty. Now, Exhibit C shows that she began her journey at DXCT at precisely 1 hour. However, if we were to plug in this value, t equals 1, to her that piecewise function, you were to come out with a value of 48. This represents the amount of miles that she traveled from when she reached DXDT. However, if you were to plug this same value into Exhibit B, you would result with a value of 46 miles, which is not the same as in Exhibit C. Now we know that Miss Morrison could not have been in two different places at one time. So these roadside cameras couldn't have been correct, because if you were to combine Exhibits B and Exhibit C, it's not a continuous function. Therefore, with the evidence provided in Exhibits B and C, these are completely useless to this case and therefore have to be thrown out of this case.
Court for some reason.
Well, that was good. Good job.
So good.
D.
We're gonna win this case.
We're gonna win. Even after disproving both Exhibits B and C, the prosecution has yet presented a fourth piece of evidence in which they claim to have tracked down the accused through an air tracking system. Exhibit D shows a velocity chart and piecewise function, asserting certain intervals in which Miss Morrison was supposedly speeding. However, if we look back at Exhibit A, the total distance was calculated to be 100 miles. If Exhibit D were to be valid, then the area under the curve in the piecewise function would also have to equal to 100 miles in order for this piece of evidence to be legitimate. This can be found through the utilization of a graphing calculator, using the intervals of the domain within each equation of the piecewise function as the lower and upper bounds of the given intervals. However, the area under the curve of the piecewise function in Exhibit D comes out to about 118 miles. Since the two exhibits do not correlate to 100 miles, Exhibit D is therefore invalid.
Jury of the court. Throughout the whole trial, the prosecution has brought forward evidence trying to accuse Ms. Morrison, our defendant, of illegally speeding during her trip from Acceleratron to G prime. They presented Exhibits A through D, claiming that they have valid information to prove their accusations. However, as we proved, Exhibits B through D contained invalid evidence. Therefore, the only remaining evidence was Exhibit A, which showed that Ms. Morrison could have been driving at a constant speed of 43 miles per hour, which is less than the speed limit. Therefore, the prosecution does not have any evidence whatsoever to prove that Ms. Morrison was speeding.